Welcome, welcome, welcome. Part of our continuing series where we talk to people on the left, people on the right, and professors from around America. We're close to about 200. With us today is Donald P. Green. He's a professor of political science out of the world famous Columbia University. I actually went there for a month once years ago. Beautiful campus. So, uh, He's the professor of political science. A research interests are American politics and political methodology. And he works at Columbia University in the city of New York. Beautiful campus. Donald P. Green is the J.W. Burgess Professor of Political Science at Columbia University, having moved there in 2011 after 22 years at Yale University. He's the author of 5 books and more than 100 essays. He studies an array of topics: voting behavior, partisanship, mass media, hate crime, and research methods. Much of his current work field experimentation to study the ways in which political campaigns mobilize and persuade voters. Very relevant for what we're looking at. He was elected to the American Academy of Arts and Sciences in 2003 and was awarded the Heinz I. Elau Award for the best article published in the American Political Science Review during 2019. That's very impressive. In 2010, he helped found the experimental research section of the American Political Science Association and served as its first president. He's worked at Columbia University in the Department of Political Science. He's worked at Yale University as the director for the Institution of Social and Policy Studies, and he'd been there for 20 years prior. He has a PhD in political science, a MA in political science from Berkeley, both from Berkeley, great universities. Oh, and a political science and history from UCLA. Wow, that's some solid California education. Some of the works he's worked on is Get Out the Vote, How to Increase Voter Turnout, Partisan Hearts and Minds, Political Parties and Social Identities of Voters. Awesome. Pathologies of Rational Choice Theory, a critique of applications of political science, advances in experimental political science. He also teaches studies for politics and economics, political psychology, experimental design and analysis, theories and debates in American politics. And what is COLLOQ?
Oh, it's a colloquium. It's an abbreviation, probably by some administrative computer.
Okay. And this is the study where I found him. But before we do that, let's check in and see how well we did. Professor, did I say anything wrong? Is there something I need to correct?
Close enough.
Okay. Good. Wow. You're the first person to say that. I like that. Very easygoing. Okay. Before I read this, why did you do this study? This is the question I always ask. Why did you do this study? Why did you think it was worthwhile? Why did you think it was a good topic? Why did you do the study when you did? What was going on in the world? What did you see? What was involved with you?
Very well. I'll try to unravel the tangle of questions.
Yeah.
Years ago, I co-authored a book called Partisan Hearts and Minds, which was essentially an argument that although the scholars of that time, this is more than 20 years ago, were beginning to think of party attachments as a kind of rational calculation of costs and benefits. I'm going to be a Republican because they're going to enact policies that will redound to my personal benefit. Or I'm going to vote Democrat because I think, the kinds of policies that Democrats enact if in office would redound to my personal benefit. And I think that, there's something to that, but at the same time, there was a stickiness to partisanship that seemed to go far beyond the policies that the parties had on offer. And what we found in that study was that if you look over the broad sweep of panel surveys, not just in the United States, but across several countries, what you find is that when you interview people and then re-interview them and then re-interview them about their partisanship, sometimes decades apart, you find that their partisanship is remarkably stable, that the partisan attachments that high school seniors had in 1965 were amazingly predictive of how they answered in 1982 and 1997, even though, of course, circumstances were totally different. And so that led us to conclude that partisanship is really much more like a social attachment, a social identity akin to religious identity, not something that you're continually updating based on what religions have on offer, but rather more a way that you think of yourself. So in that spirit, we wondered in the wake of the Trump revolution whether that characterization needed to be updated. And in particular, we thought, well, maybe the upheaval, not just in the Republican Party, but on both sides, would have been sufficient to shake the moorings of party attachments for both Democrats and Republicans. So, for example, on the one hand, you have Donald Trump upending many of the kind of basic planks of the Republican platform insofar as he was accentuating certain issues. And you have Bernie Sanders and the progressive wing of the Democratic Party doing the same thing. So the question is, since we've heard so much about the switching allegiances of, say, the non-college educated white people, maybe there would be some movement if we looked at so-called panel surveys, which is to say surveys that interview people initially and then re-interview them over time. And so that's the origin of this paper.
When was this paper written? When did you conduct the study?
I think we wrote it, Paul Platzman and I, about 2.5 years ago, 2 years ago, and it was published earlier this year, or I guess now earlier last year. Given the long trudging path of academic papers to publication, that's relatively brisk.
Yeah, and we appreciate the methodology and the discipline that everyone in academia has to follow, so that we can actually know what's true and what's not true. I've continually been, I've read about how there's some academic journals in Bosnia. I know it's not a top academic nation, but they've had like a lot of papers get published that were fake, and they had to repeal them, and it really hurt their university system and their kind of respect with the institutions. And I'm just glad that we don't have that here at that scale, and we have a better ability to go, this is true, this is not true, based upon what the evidence shows. So it is a valuable resource. And when you do not have it in a society, you notice. I think we've become very privileged in America that we've always had this for like 200 to 300 years since Harvard got started. There's other countries where this dissipates. I remember Iraq, the second invasion, all the professors and teachers left, and that country struggled to get back on its feet. That's neither here nor there. Why do this study 2 years ago? I know the answer, and I know that you know the answer, but if you could talk to me both as an American and just a person with two working eyeballs and a human heart, why is this an important topic 2 years ago? What's going on in America? Why did you think that this was worthy and that people would find it interesting?
Well, one thing that, of course, happened, at least around the time that this paper was written, was the transition from Trump to Biden. Now, the interesting thing about the panel studies that we were analyzing was that they were looking at the transition from Obama to Trump. And so our studies looked at people who were initially interviewed during the Obama administration and asked, given all that had changed between the Obama administration through the Trump administration, had they changed their assessment of who they were and what their partisanship was? Were they still calling themselves Democrats or Republicans in the same way that they were when they were first interviewed during the first Obama administration? So that was essentially the question. And part of the reason to ask that question was, it seems to the naked eye that the politics of today look very different from the seemingly more genteel politics of that era. And so one wonders whether people came to think twice about their partisan attachments, given the level of invective, given other things that were associated with partisanship.
Can you briefly, I don't want to diverge from the study too much, but how did somebody vote for Obama and then vote for Trump? I've read about these voters who they voted for Obama and then they really identified with Trump later on, especially in states like Iowa and the Northeast. How does that happen? I still struggle to understand that.
I would say that one way to think about it is to think that roughly the country is divided crudely into thirds. Roughly a third are Democrats, roughly a third, maybe a few little bit less, are Republicans, and roughly a third are self-styled independents. So they don't really attach themselves clearly with one party or the other. Some of them have kind of weak party attachments, but it's at least a quarter of the electorate that doesn't have strong attachments, and can vote for either Democrats or Republicans and swing back and forth. So when you think about what happened in the first Obama election against McCain, the fact that Obama won Indiana, the fact that Obama won North Carolina, I mean, it's really striking, right?
Yeah.
So there were obviously large numbers of people who were sloshing around and looking for a candidate who extended hope to them or inspired them in some other way through their persona. And you could well imagine how a largely Republican-leaning independent in the state of Indiana might go for Obama in 2008, but also go for Trump in 2016.
They wanted something new, something different.
Yes, and their party attachments were not particularly strong, and they were, attracted by the personalities of these, quite engaging candidates.
This is almost never said, but when Obama came out, he was new and different. When Trump came out, he was new and different. Both those guys were very different from what we'd seen before when they came out. So there is that. It's new. It's shiny. I've never seen that before.
Yes.
Okay, let me read this, and then I have a few questions on that. The past decade has witnessed profound changes in the tenor of American party politics. These changes, in tandem with growing effective polarization and residential segregation by party, the big sword, raise the questions of whether party identification is itself changing. Using 3 multi-wave panel surveys that stretch from the first Obama administration through the Trump administration, this paper takes a fresh look at the stability of party identification using several different statistical approaches to differentiate true partisan change from response error. Perhaps surprisingly, the pace of partisan change observed between 2011 and 2020 is quite similar to the apparent rates of changes in panel surveys going back to the 1950s. That's shocking. Few respondents experience appreciable change in party identification in the short run, but the pace at which partisan changes implies that substantial changes are relatively common over voters' lifespan. So few respondents experience appreciable change in party identification in the short run, but the pace at which partisanship changes implies that substantial changes are relatively common. So it is normal for a person to go from hardcore Democrat to hardcore Republican over the span of decades, or
it can happen. It's rare. It's not going to happen to most people. But the idea that party attachments are the so-called unmoved mover is almost certainly wrong, or it's an exaggeration. It is true, and this is, I think, the important point, that the pace of change is such that you wouldn't necessarily observe it in real time. It's not as though in the course of the 2024 election, Democrats and Republicans are going to find new things to like about the other party and change the way they think of themselves. In fact, they're not likely to do it in 2028. It's the kind of thing that moves very gradually and only for a few people. And what we were saying there is that the pace of change does not appear to have accelerated under the Obama to Trump transition.
So people aren't shifting parties that radically. The shift from Obama to Trump didn't do it. And what I think the big takeaway here is partisanship attachments are stable over decades, largely, is what you found.
For most people, that's right. And while it's possible to witness change, it's relatively rare, and it's not the kind of thing that happens in sort of front and center over relatively short periods of time, like the span of a campaign.
Right. It's probably like when I was first introduced to politics around age 9. My tia, aunt, I'm half Mexican, she was yelling at the TV and I was in the other room and I'm like, what's going on? She seemed really mad. And I'm like, and I'm a little child. So whenever the adults are mad, I'm like, oh, something bad's going to happen. Right. And I thought somebody was arguing something bad. I come around, the president's on TV. It's Ronald Reagan.
Wow.
And she's yelling at him because she doesn't like him. She's a hardcore Democrat and
Interesting.
disappointed. And I go, Mom, she's yelling at the president. You can't do that. And my mom goes, actually, in this country, you can. And that's what makes us awesome, is that anybody can say whatever they want within reason to the president, and they don't have to like it. And I remember that blew my mind. But 3 decades later, she's softened some of her opinions on Reagan. Now, she can't tell you when that happened or what happened, and it was over 3 to 4 decades. I just remember being a hardcore anti-Reagan firebrand, and somehow she softened or saw things a little bit differently over the course of 30 to 40 years. But if you asked her, when did you make the change? She's like, I don't know. I just remember I was there, and now I'm here. And in her mind, it wasn't that big a change. It's kind of weird and gradual.
That's the perfect anecdote. That's the
Okay.
perfect illustration of this.
Okay, yeah. And thank you, Tia. And word up to Uncle Bill. Let me cover a little bit more of this. Although much has changed in American politics during the decades since the path-breaking 1956 to 1960 ANES panel survey, the stability of party identification during the Obama-Trump era looks very much as it did during the Eisenhower administration, or for that matter, during the eras encompassing Vietnam, Watergate, stagflation, the Iran hostage crisis, the Reagan ascendancy, the Iran-Contra scandal, and the Persian Gulf War. During the 2011 to 2020 period, raw correlations between party identification scores measured in successive waves of panel interviews tend to be quite high by comparison to most political attitudes. They are higher still when corrections are made for measurement error. Whether these corrections derive from instrumental variables, regression, or down-to-earth approaches such as index creation, disattenuated, yes, correlations implied that the party identification changes at a glacial pace. I think that was your main point. The same picture emerges from other ways of describing partisan change statistically. Individual level response variation is relatively rare across panel waves, pattern affirmed by other recent studies of multi-wave panels, most notably Tucker et al. 2019. We analyzed 20 waves of TAPS panels from 2011 to 2016. Why did you specifically outline these specific events? Vietnam, Watergate, stagflation, the Iran hostage crisis. These are not necessarily just a presidential administration, but specific moments in history. What was the point of looking at those for the purpose of this study?
Because each one of those events has, by pundits, been credited with a shift in party loyalties. And there are lots and lots of essays purporting to show that Vietnam scrambled up party identities in this country, or at least caused an upcoming generation of young people to become independents rather than partisans. And the same could be said for stagflation and economic discontent. And the list goes on and on. The Reagan ascendancy probably has the best case for it in terms of changing partisanship, in part because Reagan's rebound in 1984 was a kind of watershed moment for the Republicans of the South to comfortably embrace the Republican Party that had for decades and decades been the minor party. So the trends that were already afoot by the time Reagan came to office were accelerated by him and by his successor, George H.W. Bush.
And so even though there was all these events that other people said really shifted partisan loyalty, what you found was that it's still relatively durable over decades, even despite all of these supposed events that were going to change the way people thought about things.
That's right. I think that one of the striking things is about the Southern realignment. I mean, there's no doubt that the whites in the South have shifted their attachments from the Democratic Party to the Republican Party over time. But what's interesting about that is when you look at panel surveys where you're re-interviewing the same person over time, you realize that they are moving relatively little and that it's the Grim Reaper that is causing the change in the South. That new generations of whites are solidly Republican, and they replaced solidly Democratic older generations. And after decades of that, the typical Southern white is Republican.
It's fascinating. Just a little bit of history. When for the viewers, when Reagan announced his presidential campaign, the way that he was able to start the Southern realignment was he went to the county where they had executed the 2 African American and Jewish men who went down to register people to vote, and that's where he announced his presidency. Just kind of hinting at things. It's what we call dog whistling today, but people didn't know what that was at the time. But that was part of it. Professor, as we're winding down, a few last questions. Is political polarization bad? I've heard some people say, no, it's fine. I've heard a lot of people say, oh my God, did you see January 6th? What the hell are you talking about? Is it bad? Is it okay? We went through the 1960s. This is just kind of America. It's a rough and tumble country. Or, oh my God, things are breaking down that were stable before, and we're in a new type of era that we've never actually faced before. Which one do you feel is more appropriate?
Well, I'm certainly no moral philosopher, so it's not as though I'm going to give kind of normative guidance to the world. But I would say that in terms of just cause and effect, one of the things that's interesting about strong party attachments is that they dampen the extent to which partisans are swayed by new events. So those events could be a scandal. Those events could be a policy shift. Those events could be anything. But to the extent that you're so far over on the partisan scale that you really never cross the threshold of voting for the other party, essentially the concern is that political accountability will suffer because politicians on both sides know that their base won't desert them if things go bad, and that could be accentuated in a world with unusually partisan mass media or strikingly supportive partisan donors, things that might reinforce messages that would dampen the forces of accountability. So the concern about polarization is that there won't be enough people left to punish misbehavior. In a way, this returns us to those political independents of whom we spoke earlier. To the extent that they are essentially casting the decisive vote, the good news is, well, because they lack partisan moorings, they can punish bad behavior. But the bad news is because they don't have a party attachment, and may not have any ideological attachments either, they can be swayed by the force of personality. And so this was always the concern dating back all the way to World War II about swing voters.
That's impressive. Could you say that one more time? The critique of independent or swing voters, they don't have attachments. So just one more time, please.
Right. The critique of swing voters is that on the one hand, although they are potentially decisive in elections and may be able to cast votes that would hold misbehavior accountable, the downside of independence is that they lack the kind of partisan or ideological mooring that makes them accountable perhaps on policy grounds. The concern is that they would be more attracted to candidates by dint of their personality. And so the concern about independence is that they are responsive perhaps to people we might derisively call demagogues. And so, there is a kind of side of political science that studies campaigns and elections that has long been skeptical of people who are so-called floating voters, because the argument is these are the people who voted for Hitler in 1932 and 1933.
That's fascinating. That's for the audience, it's a very famous story. Typically in America, we say democracy is great, but then you always have to acknowledge this historical period where Hitler was voted into power. So, I guess just if I may, was January 6th scary? Is a period of one party says the other side just didn't win and we're going to act like that for 4 years. And then the other side says, well, now I'm in power. I'm going to use the power of the administration to start arresting you guys. Is that normal? Is that good? Or is that really bad and a deviation from traditional ways that America's worked since the 1950s?
I'm inclined to, at this point, think of Zhou Enlai, the former premier of China, during the first American interviews of him
Yes,
in the early
please.
1970s, as American relations with China were warming up. He was asked about the French Revolution. He said, "Well, and what he thought of it." He said, "It's too soon to tell." And that's sort of the way I feel about January 6th. It's hard to say what the moral of the story is until we know how it plays out, because right now it's unclear whether the fallout from that event will cost Trump the election in 2024 or whether he will be elected despite it. And of course, the moral of the story will be very different depending on the outcome.
Fascinating point. Fascinating point. Okay. Uh, do Americans calm down and come back together and reduce the amount of animosity naturally in the future? Will we just kind of get over it? I mean, we were told Joe Biden's going to be elected and he's going to heal the soul of the nation and, quotes, bring a national calming. He said that. Many people in his administration also said that. And yet we still see MAGA, and I'm watching TV, and there's people jumping up and down going, oh, my God, MAGA's here. Trump's still here. It's the end of the world. It's still coming. Didn't seem like they bought the whole we've turned a corner. Does America pull out of this, or do we limp along for decades?
I think we limp along. Part of the reason I think we limp along is that part of the source of hysteria is that hysteria draws attention and sells products. It sells commercials and advertising time and clicks and the kinds of things that can be monetized. And so to the extent that the media is kind of in free fall for economic reasons, it needs this kind of clash in order to basically draw audiences. And so I would say to the extent that people gradually burn out on this style of media coverage or elite discourse, we muddle through. Now, of course, again, it might be that the Grim Reaper needs to kill off a certain number of people who might be prone to stoke those kinds of concerns, but that might take quite a long time. And so it's not clear whether this is a generational problem or this is a kind of economic problem. But I don't think that it's a kind of inherent feature of American sensibilities, because although we occasionally get animated about politics and have the occasional civil war, what's kind of interesting about the United States is the extent to which we're basically a mercantile people. We don't really stick with conflict for very long before we want to get back to selling things. And that's in part why we don't fight very long wars. We tend to fight relatively short wars before we're tired of them.
That's a great point. Okay. Last question. Last two questions. You're not you. You're not me. You're a third-party person. They're watching this interview. Wow, did they learn a lot? And they've heard some controversial things that really changed their perspective on the issue. But they're struggling to remember it all. However, it's a week later after they've watched this video. And while they're struggling to remember everything in the video, there was this one thing that the professor said that they can't get out of their head 5 days later after watching. What is that one sticky thought that an average person you'll never meet won't be able to stop thinking about 5 days after watching this video?
I guess it would be something like this. If the people at home were to take a moment to just write down their partisanship, in other words, they ask themselves the question, in general, when it comes to politics, do I think of myself as a Democrat, Republican, Independent, or what? And they write down the answer to that question on some note and put it in a box. If they open up that box in 10 years, they'll answer it the same way.
Uh, little sidebar question, real quick. You said we might limp along for decades. I've seen a few people say, Mark, the idea of civil war or January 6th happening again is ridiculous. Come on, man. We're not going to do that. But then they would say, I could see us devolving to a Brazil quality level democracy and just staying there for decades. So the idea of a super big clash, ridiculous, but kind of devolving into this not super great democracy and then just you stay there. What do you think of that theory? Unreasonable? Something to it?
Not totally crazy in the sense that, again, I don't think it's something I would bet on, but it's not
Sure.
crazy in the sense that I think that one of the things that people have been reminded of over the last several years is how thin the veneer of our institutions really is. That we have the rule of law and a kind of fleet of judges and a fleet of people who oversee judges, and we have legislatures and we have a constitutional regime. But basically, our constitutional regime is fraught with contradictions. We have different principles of sovereignty. Sometimes it's popular sovereignty, sometimes it's state sovereignty. We have different schools of constitutional interpretation. And so we could easily sidle into a very different kind of constitutional regime in which basically states call the shots. And this is, I think, been the tension since 1789, if not before, and it continues to be the tension. It becomes more and more of a tension as our elections again and again produce asymmetries where the electoral college goes one way and the popular vote goes another way, because that's, again, out of step with our modern conception of what popular sovereignty means. So all of these things, I don't think they lead us to civil war necessarily, but they lead to a kind of nagging sense that our institutions are broken. And of course, one thing we know from American history, we're quite confident, it is not easy to change our institutions. Part of the reason we have this kind of wacky, 18th century hybrid constitutional regime is that we could never get away from it.
I remember that. I think it was Thomas Jefferson said that we need to change the Constitution every 25 years. Most modern democracies change their Constitution every 25 years. We've never changed it, I think, in 200. There was some statistic like that.
Well, you could make the argument that the Constitution did undergo some overhauls at various points in American history, although that's a kind of that's
Sure.
that's something you should talk to a constitutional
Sure.
law professor about. But I would say that it certainly, I certainly think that it is extremely dangerous to say, oh, every 50 years we're going to revise our constitutional regime, because of course that is the opportunity for all manner of mischief to be let loose. But the problem is we've never really been in a constitutional regime that operates under the same kind of modern standards that we all more or less presuppose. We presuppose that we're going to have winner take all elections in a kind of popular sovereignty sort of mode, but we don't actually have that kind of electoral system. We have something more complex, and the fact that we have a checks and balance system, but at the same time a party-driven system where parties were never part of the Constitution,
right,
means that there's always this kind of sense of puzzlement about what checks and balances or division of powers means in a system with unitary party control.
Right. And the founding fathers, I think some of them warned against parties, and then
That's right. They didn't want to have parties. They were against factionalism. But the irony is, we're kind of, unwittingly maybe, or maybe we're doing it deliberately, but not in a kind of planned and open way. We're sidling toward a Westminster system where parties essentially organize government, and we could do that. We could do it in a kind of combination of ways, but the idea that we're going to have that kind of party-driven unitary system without saying so explicitly, or kind of owning up to it in terms of our sense of division of powers, is a kind of odd thing that kind of reflects the broad gridlock of American politics. But it's not a new thing. I mean, the broad gridlock of American politics has been going on for decades and decades.
I can't prove it, but I had to take a class on Soviet history when I was in college. And one of the things they taught us, two things that shocked me. One was that when Stalin was around, the Russian people didn't know that Stalin was killing them off. So they actually liked Stalin and they'd write letters to Stalin saying, "You're a good guy," because they didn't know because he lied to them. The other one was that their system started to implode about late 60s, early 70s. Now, if you go back to the 30s and 1950s, there was actually a debate on if communism was better than democracy. Stalin and Mao were doing these 5-year plans. People kind of like, wow. But by the 1970s, it was clear that the Soviet system wasn't working. But it would be another 2 decades or something before it fall. There was a common story, though, in the late 70s, though, of we'll pretend to believe you guys are leading, meaning we won't revolt, and you pretend to actually do something, meaning they felt their government didn't work. They felt their politicians weren't responsive. They were just going through the motions. And they had that idea in the 70s of, well, I mean, our Soviet system isn't going to collapse, but it doesn't really work for us. But we'll just keep going through the motions. And they did that for a decade or two before it finally collapsed. I'm wondering if it's capable for Americans to enter into such a period of, I don't know, blind largesse, where we're, the frog in the boiling pot. It's just a little warmer. It's just a little warmer. It's fine. It's just a little warmer. Oh my God, the whole thing collapsed. How'd that happen? Well, slowly over 2 decades, you just didn't pay attention. Is that a crazy thought for America?
Conceivable, but I guess the difference that's so palpable is that the United States is a kind of economic dynamo, the likes of which you can't really find in other countries. I mean, you can certainly see high growth countries, but those high growth countries often have inherent flaws in terms of the ways in which they operate, so that they have kind of a crony capitalism that is sort of fundamentally unstable. It's in terms of pretty much every kind of natural endowment that would lead to economic vitality, the United States is still about the best thing going. And so if we fall apart politically, okay, well, certainly there are precedents for that, including ancient Rome. But it won't necessarily be because of stagnation.
Right. Was it China became a unified government, and then it had periods of breaking up, but they never stopped being Chinese, and eventually they ended up unified again. Okay, we'll leave it there. I really appreciate your time. Thank you for coming out. You don't have to answer. I'll send you a copy of the video. If you're willing, we like to keep the conversation going. We always ask for recommendations. You don't have to name anybody, but we'll ask when I send you a copy of the video. Other than that, I want to say thank you for coming out, and I really appreciate your time and you illuminating this issue for everybody. It's I don't think it's something a lot of people think. I think they think, we're way more radical and reactive these days, and to hear not so much. The data doesn't exactly show that, and that your political identities are very stable. It's an intriguing conclusion.
Thanks for having me. It was kind of fun.
Okay. I'll email you a copy soon, and I want to say thank you for your time.
Very good.
Okay.
Bye now.